Hi everyone, my name is Shalhevet Schwartz, and this is Gefet on Daf Yomi, a joint project of Hadran and Yeshivat Drisha. The sugya that we are going to be tackling today is the sugya of ha'omer mutar, or one who thought it was permitted, a person who violates an isur Torah because not because of a mistake in some kind of in the reality of the situation, but because of a mistake that he made with regard to the halacha, thought that the thing that he was doing, which was forbidden, was in fact permitted. And this will give us a window into actually the relationship between natural and religious ethics, or the relationship between moral virtue and right what it means to be a morally virtuous person and what it means to be an Oved Hashem. Um, so let's get started with our sugya on Daf Samach Aleph. The Gemara gets into this via a conversation about whether it is possible, right, about worshiping Avodah Zarah, me'ahava u'miyira. So there's machloka between Abaye and Rava about a person who is oved avodah kochavim me'ahava u'miyira, meaning someone who worships Avodah Zarah not because she believes that this is actually a deity with power, but because um, of some kind of social reason, a person who this person likes or respects or fears, um, wants them to serve Avodah Zarah, and therefore they worship this, let's say, idol, false deity. So in a case like that, is that person considered to have worshipped Avodah Zarah or not? Machloket between Abaye and Rava. Abaye omer chayav, Rava omer patur. So Abaye thinks that person is chayav. That person really has worshipped Avodah Kochavim, and Rava thinks they have not. Right, Abaye omer chayav dehapalcha. Right, Abaye says you're chayav because when push comes to shove, they bowed down or served in some way this deity. Rav omer patur I kable ale be'eloha in I lo lo. That fundamentally part of the definition of avodah zarah requires kabbalah be'elo, right? Right, kable ale be'eloha, right? That taking on this deity for you as a deity, meaning believing in it, believing in its power, wanting to serve it or worship it. And in this particular case, in which I was serving it for some kind of external reason, that doesn't really count. Um, Now, within this debate between Abaye and Rava, so Abaye is going to bring a proof from a Braita about the korban of a Kohen Mashiach who worships Avodah Zarah. So, V'amar Abaye mina minallah. So Abaye says, where am I proving this from? Titania, Kohen Mashiach ba'avodat kochavim, Rebbe omer b'shiggat maaseh, v'chachamim omrim be'he'elem davar. So there's a Braita, right, that a Kohen Mashiach who brings a korban for avodah zarah by accident. Rebbe says that this korban is brought for shigat maaseh, and Chachamim say that it is brought for he'elem davar. So shigat maaseh is some kind of mistake in practice, and Chachamim say for some kind of he'elem davar, some kind of forgetting of the matter. V'shavin sheb'sirat yachid v'shavin she'en mevi hasham talui. So they agree about various things that the Kohen Mashiach brings a korban chatat, a seirah, like a yachid in other cases, and a nasham talui in a case where he didn't know whether or not he in fact sinned. But what we see here is this difference of opinion between Rabbi and Chachamim about whether or not the korban is brought for shiggat maaseh and he'elim davar. Now the Gemara is going to try to understand what each of those phrases refer to. What is the shiggat maaseh and what is the he'elim davar? Hi, shiggat maaseh avodah zarah hechidami. So what could be a shiggat maaseh of avodah zarah, right? With if I eat chaylev by accident, it's pretty clear what happened. Chaylev looks like a whole lot of other kinds of meat, and I thought that the chaylev was permitted fat, and then I ate it. Sure, that's shigat maaseh chaylev. But shigat maaseh of avodah zarah is a little bit more complicated. How do you worship a foreign god by accident? Ikasavar beit knesset hu vishtach velo, or libo l'shamayim. Right? If the item he was worshiping, if this Kohen thought he was in a beit knesset, and it turned out he was in a church, right? And then he bowed, so libo l'shamayim. His heart was in the right place. His heart was towards God. So how can you define that? Forget an accident of avodah zarah. How can you define that as avodah zarah at all? Ella dechaza andarta vishtachavalo. Rather, it's talking about a case where he saw an andarta, he saw some kind of monument or pesel, and bowed to it. Right, this clearly was he was right. He was bowing to an idol that was of avodah zarah. And now we're going to ledayek further in that. Ikable be'eloha mezidu, right? If he actually took it on right, believed in it, worshipped it as a god, then that should be mezid. So we still don't really know what our case of shigat says. Ilo kable be'eloha, and if he didn't take it, right, if he didn't believe in it, take it on as a deity, so then lo klumhu again. What was he? This shouldn't even be considered shogeg. He didn't really do anything. Elalav me'ahava u'miyira. So rather, this must be talking about a case where he worshipped it me'ahava u'miyira, right? Not that he was just, leaning over and ended up making a bowing motion, but didn't have any intention to bow. He really did have intention to bow, have intention to serve this deity, but just not because um, he really believed in it or really worshipped it. So me'ahava u'miyira, that seems to be the case. Um, this seems to be a proof for Abai. This seems to be a case of Shigat Masa. Now, Rava is going to respond to that, and this is where the concept of Omer Mutar is going to come into the picture. Rava Amar Lach, Rava would respond to that. Lo be'Omer Mutar. The case that we're talking about of Shigat Masa v'Vodazara is a case of Omer Mutar, a case of a person who thought, right, knew that what he was doing, knew that he was worshiping a foreign god, but thought that it was permitted to do so. Now the Gemara is going to respond, wait, how can that be Shigat Maseh? Omer Mutar, Hanu Ha'elim Davar. Omer Mutar, wouldn't that be Ha'elim Davar, the thing that Chachamim think is he brings the korban for, not the thing that Rabbi thinks you bring the korban for? So the response is going to be Omer Mutar Lagamre, and Ha'elim Davar is Kiyu Miktzad Bitul Miktzad. So both Ha'elim Davar and Shigat Maseh are both different kinds of Omer Mutar. Shigat Maseh is Omer Mutar Lagamre. I thought that the entire Isra of Avodah Zarah is not is mutter, is permitted, and Ha'elim Davar is I forgot a piece of it. So maybe I thought it was not okay to sacrifice to this foreign god, but bowing to it, maybe I didn't realize that was a problem. So Rava thinks that this case of Shigat Maseh, when it comes to Avodah Zarah, is the case of Omer Mutar. Now, Tosafot, as Tosafot is wont to do, is going to bring a apparent stira between this sugya and a different sugya, the sugya in Makot. What we saw here in our sugya in Sanhedrin is that Rava thinks that Omer Mutar is considered to be like a certain kind of category of shogeg, right, and is treated like shogeg, and that he brings a korban to achieve kapara. But Tosafot points us to Reish Parak HaGolin, which is the second parak of Makot, about a Rotzeach Bishkaga, person who murders unintentionally. Ubereish HaGolin to Memai Rabba mi Bishkaga Parat le'Omer Mutar, where where Rava is mima'it from the word bishkaga. He says that comes to exclude the case of Omer Mutar. So we're going to see the solutions that Tosafot brings in a moment, but let's just look at that bright as the broad in Masechet Makot and Rava's response to it, so we can understand what the contradiction that Tosafot's contradiction here. So Tanu Rabbanan. Right, it says bishkaga prat lemezid bivli da'at prat lemitkaveh. Now, when the pasuk talking about a man who goes to an ir miklat after murdering someone by accident, it says the word bishkaga. Right, if you kill someone bishkaga and and he kills someone bivli da'at, then he goes to an ir miklat. So the Brita says the bishkaga is coming to exclude a case of mezid, a case of someone who killed on purpose, and bli da'at coming to exclude someone who is mitkaveh, who is intentional. Gemara asks on this, Mezid, Pshita, Bar Katalahu. How could it be that the pasuk is coming to exclude Mezid? Obviously, he doesn't go to an Miklat, he gets the death penalty. Amarava, so what? Ema Prat Omer Mutar. What do we mean when we say Prat Mezid? What we mean when we say Prat Mezid is that it's coming to exclude an Omer Mutar. This Omer Mutar, the person who thought it was permitted. Abai responds to that. Amar le Abai, I Omer Mutar. If he was Omer Mutar, Anusu, right? Then of course, right? He's anus. He's not close to. He's not like Mezid. He's an anus. And Amar le Rava responds, Shani Omer ha-Omer Mutar karov le So Rava responds, no. Actually, an Omer Mutar, someone who thought that what he was doing was permitted, isn't like an anus. He's not considered to have been These aren't considered to have been circumstances beyond his control. Rather, he's considered to have been karov the mezid, and therefore parat the mezid in the Braita can mean that that can actually be coming to exclude this case of Omer Mutar. So, right, just to see the apparent contradiction between the case of Avodah Zarah that we saw in Sanhedrin and our sugya and the case of murder that we see in right the in Yom Miklat in the Perek HaGolim. So for Rava, when it comes to murder, Omer Mutar is not like a shogeg. He can't go to an Yom Miklat because he's karov mezid. Whereas for Rava and Avodah Zarah, it seems like Omer Mutar is like a shogeg, and the high priest brings a korban chatat. So on the one hand, Omer Mutar, maybe it's like shogeg and avodah zarah. On the other hand, when it comes to rotzeach bishkaga, seems like it is like murder. And we're just gonna Tosfot's gonna even add another case that seems to be a contradiction here. We're gonna add another Gemara to the party. Vikashed v'gabe chelev v'gabe Shabbat. Right, when it comes to the isurim of chelev and Shabbat, ichtiv b'shnehem shkaga v'chayavin b'perek klal gadol v'tinok shenishba levin anochrim. So right there, also in the case of a person who eats chaylev and or violates Shabbat, we saw there that that the Gemara basically brings a problem of how could it be that someone could only bring one korban chatat if they violated Shabbat in many different ways. Theoretically, you bring a different korban chatat for every av malacha that you do wrong. But there can be a situation when it comes to violating Shabbat where you only bring one chatat. That's the Gemara in Shabbos that we're not going to go into right now. And the Gemara answers that question by basically saying that that we're talking about a case of a tinok shenish balav anofrim, meaning a Jewish child who was raised without Torah and mitzvot, was raised among Gentiles, and therefore for that reason doesn't know that Shabbat is a problem. Essentially, right, a meta category of Omer Mutar, right, not a regular shogeg, not someone who didn't realize that specifically what they were doing was considered tolesh, um, but someone who really didn't know what Shabbat was at all and didn't know that it was a source. So there, right, that there too, it's considered the Gemara there considers that to be a case of shogeg. So really we've got three cases of Omer Mutar, and in one of them, in the murder case, Rava says that it seems to be not like shogeg, can't go to Omer Mutar because it's Korov Mesid, whereas in Avodah Zarah and when it comes to Chaylev and Shabbat, right, a Tinok Shenishba essentially is an Omer Mutar. And Omer Mutar is defined as a shogeg. Now Tosafot is going to bring us two different answers, and each of them I think will give us a different window into something interesting about the nature of mitzvot and the nature of Yom Miklat on the one hand, and the nature of mitzvot more broadly on the other. So, right, Tosafot's question, right? How could it be that Bereish Golim Mamai Rava Mibishkaga Prato Omer Mutar? How could it be that Rava thinks there that Omer Mutar is not like a shogeg and is actually Karov Mizid? Answer number one, Hatam Garas Rabba de Ane Bai Batre. There in the sugya in Makot, this is Tosfot's first answer. We can solve the problem by saying that you thought it was Rava, but actually it was a different person. It was not Rava. It was Rabba with a hey, not with an aleph. We know that because Abaye answered after him, and Rabba was a teacher of Rava and Abaye, who were contemporaries, and the fact that Abaye's answer comes after Rabba or after Rava, there is an indicator that actually maybe we shouldn't read it as Rava, we should read it as Rabba. So there's no contradiction because two different people. We thought Rava was contradicting himself. Actually, one of them wasn't Rava at all. So that's answer number one. Answer number two, Inami Gabi Galut Tuva Bishgaga Ktive. But when it comes to Galut, when it comes to the case of the Rotzeach Bishgaga, the person who unintentionally kills, there, the word shkaga appears many times, which is to say that the word shkaga, right, the emphasis on the word shkaga comes to tell us that only bona fide shogeg, which is to say only a bona fide accident goes to an Yom Miklat, and that in other cases, like the case of an Omer Mutar, we treat him like a Mazid specifically when it comes to Galut, even when we wouldn't in other rules. So, right, two ways of being Miyashev Stira. One is by saying there's no Stira because the person who you thought was contradicting himself is actually not contradicting himself. The second answer is that the deen in the case of the Rotzeach Bishgaga, the rule in the case of the person who kills unintentionally is actually different than it is in other cases. So I want to explore first the second answer, which will give us right, and I think if we think more deeply and more broadly about why might it be, Tosafot's leaning on a pasuk here, right? The fact that the word shgaga appears multiple times, but I think if we think a little bit more deeply about what might actually be behind what Tosafot's saying, we can see that um there's a sense in which there's actually some kind of rational or coherence to his shita and to why Rotseach Lishkaga might be different from other cases. So the Rambam in Shmona Prakim goes into a distinction between two different kinds of mitzvot that, right, the kinds of mitzvot that mitzvot sichliot, right, rational mitzvot that we would have been able to deduce on our own were it not for revelation, that we didn't really need revelation in order to tell us, let's say, right, in order to tell us not to steal, in order to tell us not to swear falsely, who knows, um, not to bear false witness. That's one kind of mitzvah, and the other kind of mitzvot are the mitzvot that he calls mitzvot shim'iot, or mitzvot that whose authority comes from their revealed nature, the kinds of mitzvot that we wouldn't have been able to think of on our own were it not for the Torah. So the Rambam here deals, I'm not going to read it inside, but deals with an apparent contradiction between the words of the philosophers and the words of Chazal about the question of which is better, a chassid or a kovesh et yitzra. Is it better to have someone who is kind of inherently virtuous, who isn't even tempted to sin, or is it better to have someone who is kovesh et yitzra, who might have sinned otherwise, but because of the tzava eloki, because of God's words, decides not to sin? So, according to Chazal, one who conquers his yetzer is greater than a chassid, right? And whereas according to the philosophers, the virtue ethicists, the Aristotelian virtue ethicists of the Rambam's time, the chassid is greater than the kovesh Yisrael. And so an apparent contradiction between the words of the philosophers and the words of Chazal. What is the Rambam going to do? He's going to try to right. He's not going to say, oh, they just disagree. He's going to try to find a way to harmonize um, to harmonize the Chazal's ethics with contemporary philosophy. And so what does he say? I'm gonna read the end. All right. "Aval hadvarim asher amru hachachamim hamoshel b'nafsho mehem yoter tov u'scharo yoter gadol." When the chachamim say that it's better to be kovesh et yitzro, better to beat out your yetzer than it is to be an inherently virtuous person, right? That's when it's talking about the revealed mitzvot that I wouldn't have been able to come up with on my own. They're not inherently bad things. So there's no reason to develop my personal virtue such that I'm not even tempted by them. If I want to eat a cheeseburger, great. You can want to eat a cheeseburger and you decide not to because God told you not to. That's a very virtuous thing. Whereas when it comes to not stealing, not bearing false witness, who knows what, right? When it comes to the mitzvot sichliot, those, right, part of what it means to develop to develop oneself spiritually and to be a holy, pious, virtuous person is to become the sort of person to develop one's character such that one is not even tempted by those things. So the way to resolve this contradiction, right, when it comes to the rational mitzvot, a chassid is preferable. When it comes to revealed mitzvot, one who conquers his yetzer is preferable. Um, a kind of an echo of this shows up in the Shud HaMaharik, when he is asked about a woman who is unfaithful to her husband, but because she claims that she did not know whether or not or that she did not know that it was asur to do so, right? She did not know that it was forbidden to cheat on her husband. And the question is whether or not, right, an adulterous woman, it becomes asura ba'ala, and her right, she and her husband are forbidden from having sex. So the question is, can she be right if she claims that she was omer mutar in this case? Can she claim that she was a bona fide shogeg and therefore that this isur would not apply? And the Maharik answer is no. The Maharik answers no. Right, right. She's not considered a din shogeget. I'm on the third line. Right, right, from not right because even though she thought it was mutar, the that right she had the intention to be right to limol ma'al b'isha to be unfaithful, right? He uses the word me'ila here, and he actually makes an interesting diuk in the pasuk, right? That dehaloktiv ish ki tishteisho ma'ala ma'al bashem, right? When it's said, right, when the pasuk that talks about adultery doesn't describe it as a ma'al bashem, doesn't describe it as a trespass against God, but describes it as ma'ol ma'ala bo ma'al, right? As a trespass against or a violation against her husband, right? That there's something about right the that right for the Maharik, the rule against adultery is the most a mitzvah sichlit legamri, right? It is an entirely rational commandment, and as such, a person who thought it was permitted, what does that even mean? She thought it was permitted. She was clearly right. Her act of adultery was an immoral act in and of itself, and therefore she can't understand herself to be shogeg. So right, with this distinction that we saw right in the Rambam between the mitzvot zichliot and in this Shut HaMaharik, where he addresses specifically adultery as an example of a mitzvah zichlit, we can have a better understanding, I think, of what Tosfot is saying about divrei Rava right here. This is Tosfot's second answer. When Tosfot says that when it comes to galut, um, the rule might be different, and that Omer Mutar might be considered karov lemezid because of the word shgaga as it appears many times. Maybe part of what is behind Tosfot's logic here right, is that Omer Mutar, right, the idea that I might have thought that something was permitted, that when it comes to Chalev, when it comes to Shabbat, even perhaps when it comes to Avodah Zarah, when it comes to a rule that is right, a commandment in the Torah that were it not for the Torah, I might not have otherwise come to, right? That isn't about a moral wrong, but isn't about an interpersonal moral wrong, but is in some way about my relationship with God and about the Torah itself and what it means to be a servant of God, but only that and not part of a kind of broader framework of morality. There, I think that no mer mutar, right? It's reasonable to say I thought this was permitted. And it doesn't make me a bad person for having done so. And on some level, if I thought it was permitted, I would then not have reason not to do not to do the wrong act or not to do the prohibited action. Whereas when it comes to something like murder or adultery, if I thought that, right, what does it mean that I thought something was permitted? Sure, I thought there wasn't a rule against it in the Torah, but that doesn't mean that I now am off scot-free because on some level I had other reasons not to do it. If I used my rational faculty, I could have realized that actually murder is wrong. And so why should I be defined as a shogeg in such a case? So that's the second answer in Tosfot. Now I want to take us a little bit into to try to have get a better understanding of what might be lying behind Tosfot's first answer, which seemed on its face to be a simpler answer, right? Let's just change Rabba to Rabba. So the question is, right, what might Tosfot be gaining from that, right, textually, conceptually, in the sugya? And what we see is that when it comes to the way that we understood, right, what we saw before with Rava calling calling Omer Mutar Karov Lemezid, might actually raise different problems within the world of Ir Miklat and how Rava understands Ir Miklat more broadly. So going back to the Perek HaGolin and the sugya actually a couple dapim later brings in another debate between Rava and here it's Rava and Rav Chisda, about the question of the status of one who kills derech aliyah versus derech yerida. So when it comes to Masechet Makot, right, when it comes to the isur of or to the galut to an ir miklat, right, to someone who goes to an ir miklat, only does so if he killed by accident derech yerida, which is to say that the action that he was doing was sort of helped by gravity. Let's say I'm rolling a rock down a hill and then it drops and something happens and it hits someone. So if my action was in the same direction as gravity, then I go to Mir Miklat, and when I go derech aliyah, I don't. And that's true for Yisrael. And the Gemara is going to ask about the case of a non-Jew, of a ger toshav who kills derech aliyah, and what happens to him in such a case. So Amar Rav Chisda says, Lo kasha kan shehargo derech yerida, kan shehargo derech aliyah, right? So solves a contradiction by saying derech aliyah, derech yerida, up versus down. So derech yerida di Yisrael gali, ihunami sagile begalut. Right? When it comes to derech yerida, right, the contradiction here is that a ger toshav, in one case does get galut and in one case does not. So derech yerida, where Yisrael is also gets galut, so too a ger toshav. Derech aliyah di Yisrael patur hu nehera. When it comes, but for derech aliyah, where in a case in which the Jew is exempt, who the ger toshav gets the death penalty. Rava responds, Amar le Rava, v'lav kal v'chomer hu, ma derech yerida di Yisrael gali, ihunami sagile begalut. Derech aliyah di Yisrael patur ihun nerag. So Rava is saying there's something wrong with this logic, right? If in the case of derech yerida, when the Jew gets galut, so does the ger toshav. So in derech aliyah, if the Jew is patur, why should the ger toshav get killed? And therefore Rava thinks that the ger toshav in the case of derech aliyah is also exempt. So just to when we look at this machloket, right, what's the law for a Jew who killed derech aliyah? And right, the way we I think have to understand this machloket is that Rav Chisda and Rava have different understandings of what the relationship is between derech aliyah and derech yerida. So if you look at the column on the left here, right, both Rava and Rav Chisda know that derech aliyah, the Jew, is patur, but the question is why. So Rav Chisda thinks that derech yerida, I can on some level blame what happened on gravity, but if I went derech aliyah, then on some level there was like more effort required. It's not as much of an accident. Maybe it's um closer to mezid. I'm on some level more responsible for it, um, and therefore I don't get to go to an Ir Miklat, right? I don't get to go to an Ir Miklat, um, and therefore because what happened derech aliyah was maybe a more severe, closer to mezid, and therefore the ger toshav in such a case would get the death penalty. It's clear that here that Rav Chisda thinks that an Ir Miklat is some kind of protection, right? I don't merit galut to an Ir Miklat if I did something that was maybe a little bit closer to Mezid. And right, that's for a Jew, and for a goy, because it was closer to Mezid, we would give him the death penalty. Whereas Rava, he thinks that derech aliyah is actually less severe, which is to say it's not as common a case. Maybe I was going up a hill, not downhill, so I didn't have reason to be as careful. It's a more uncommon occurrence, and therefore, the Jew who kills derech aliyah is patur, not because it's closer to Mezid, but because it's less severe. He doesn't even deserve galut, right? Which is why the ger toshav in such a case would for sure not get the death penalty. And right, when we look at this picture, we see that Rava and Rav Chisda, right, who are debating about whether or not derech aliyah, someone who kills derech aliyah goes to an Ir Miklat, are really debating about right what is the nature of an Ir Miklat. And this is a broader question that gets explored throughout Masachet Makot, really. And the question of what is the Ir Miklat? Is it a kind of punishment? On the one hand, or is it protection, right? Are we protecting you from the Goel Hadam, from the relatives of the victim who might come and kill you, on the one hand? Or is it something that, right, really you were on some level responsible for the death of this man and need to do your time? Sure, we're not going to give you the death penalty, but you need to do your time. So the picture here that emerges is one in which Rav Chisda thinks that it seems to conceptualize the Ir Miklat as more of a kind of protection, whereas Rava seems to conceptualize it as more of a punishment. And when we think about that and go back to the case of the Omer Mutar, who's Karov the Mezid, and because he's Karov the Mezid, he doesn't go to an Ir Miklat, right? That might, right, we see a kind of implicit contradiction, not a contradiction that's raised explicitly and not even raised explicitly by Tosafot, but something that seems to be a tension within the more basic underlying assumptions that Rava is working with in the sugya on Daf Zayin on the one hand and the sugya on Daf Tet on the other hand, right? In the sugya on Daf Tet, which we just saw, right, Rava thinks that a ger toshav isn't exiled for derech aliyah because, right, it's a kal v'chomer from a Jew who isn't exiled, which is to say, he fundamentally thinks that Ir Miklat is a kind of is a kind of punishment, and therefore someone who kills someone in a less severe way wouldn't go. Whereas in the Sugya on Daf Zayin, Rava thinks that Omer Mutar is Karov Lamezid, and is a Karov Lamezid doesn't go to an Ir Miklat, right? He doesn't deserve to go to an Ir Miklat, right? That picture shows us a picture in which Ir Miklat looks a little bit more like atonement or like a way, right, or like an escape, right? That someone who does a version of accidental killing that is right, a version of manslaughter that is actually more severe. He doesn't go to an Ir Miklat. So we see this kind of tension in Divrei Rava, right? And maybe that's part of what Tosafot's first answer is coming to address, right? That why are we, right, Garas Rabba, why are we changing the Sugya Daf Zayin to be Rabba versus Rava? Right. On the one hand, it helps us solve our problem of what's the status of Omer Mutar more broadly, but on the other hand, it helps us solve what seems to be an implicit tension or right, a tension or implicit contradiction within Divrei Rava about the nature of Ir Miklat and its status as a kind of protection versus its status as a punishment. So, right, what do each of these answers in Tosfot do and give us? Right, answer number one, which switches Rava and Rabba, right? Both answers explain why in Makot Rava thought that Nomer Mutar was like a Mazid. Sorry, and the with answer number one, when we switch Rava and Rabba, it's because it's Rabba, not Rava. So Rava always thought that Omer Mutar is like Shogeg, and this explains away the apparent contradiction, right, in Rava's Shita within the second parak of Makot. Whereas answer number two, right, which is that the word shogeg appears multiple times. There's a special deen in rotzech bishgaga, in manslaughter, um, in which defines an omer mutar as like a mezid rather than like a shogeg, right? This right here, right? This gets right. Perhaps leads us towards or right an understanding of a kind of fundamental difference between different kinds of mitzvot. Right, there are certain kinds of mitzvot which, were it not for the Torah, we could have come up with right. We could have come up with the isur of retzach on our own. Right, the fact that murder is wrong. Um, you don't need the Torah to tell you that murder is wrong, and therefore Rava's position about Omer Mutar in those two in the case of manslaughter might be different than it would be in the case of Shabbat, Chelev, even perhaps Avodah Zarah. So hope this right opened up a window into thinking about the way that the Torah relates to right human morality or natural morality on the one hand, and what the role of those mitzvot might be in relation to the role of the mitzvot whose whose authority or whose normativity comes simply from the fact that they are mitzvot. Thanks so much, and looking forward to seeing you next week.